All right, we might get started then. Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. We're really excited to be launching this brand new course, Middle East Mediated. There's a lot of new faces here tonight, so I'll introduce you to the Melbourne Free University before I pass on to the coordinators of this course. For those of you who haven't been here before, the Melbourne Free University is a community-based organisation, volunteer-based organisation. We've been around for about 4.5 years, and what we do is put on, or we try to create a space for engagement with knowledge, to learn off people within our community who know a lot about issues, and then to engage in really open and vibrant discussion. What that means in practice is that you're not just here as audience members. You don't just need to ask a question that has a question mark at the end and that you can fit out in 2 breaths. You can actually bring your own ideas, experiences, thoughts and knowledge to bear in the discussion part of tonight's panel event. We also run a range of other things. At the moment, if you're interested in being involved in something to do with asylum seekers, we run a Melbourne Free University specifically for asylum seekers on Wednesday nights at Trades Hall, where we try to provide the sort of broad undergraduate arts or social sciences education that you might see in a university here to asylum seekers living on bridging visas who are actually barred from accessing any education because of the conditions of those visas. So if you'd like to be involved in that, come and talk to us afterwards or have a look at our website. And with that, I'm going to pass on to Saba.
Thank you everyone for coming. We're really excited that we've had that many number of people turn up. When it was an idea, we weren't sure if anyone would be interested, so thanks for being here. Just want to welcome you to Middle East Mediated. I'm Saba Bebawi and this is Miki Sosnowski. The idea has been in the making to have these seminar series for a while. And it started when Miki interviewed me for her program Babil when she was working at Byron Bay, and she interviewed me as a journalist and an academic who's been involved with the Arab world. So we kind of hooked, and she was coming down to Melbourne, and then we thought we should do things, maybe try a radio show. No one accepted us, and a few have, so thank you so much. And we're really, really pleased and excited about that. It took us a while to get it happening, though, and I probably, this idea that Miki had was to ask people about their personal experiences and how their personal connections are with the Middle East. And being an academic, I thought, no, it has to be academic and it has to be theoretical and formal. And I guess it kind of came back to life with the Gaza-Israel crisis, war, whatever you want to call it. And I was using Facebook a lot to kind of tell the human story. So I was posting posts that were kind of more connected to the human aspect of it. And a lot of people who were not quite involved were saying, are you humanizing the conflict for us? So I went back to Miki and I said, you're right. That's how to do it. So then we approached MFU and they were excited, and here we are. We're running a series of 4 weeks, kicking off with today, which is on Syria, then on to Lebanon, Israel and Palestine, and finally with Iran. So you can see that we're trying to fit in not just Arab countries, but more of a wider Middle East kind of coverage. The format will be that Miki will be talking to our speakers, individually asking them about their personal involvement with the Middle East. And then we'll ask them the same question each, and then we'll take it to the floor, basically. One of the things I do want to point out before I hand it over to Miki is the Middle East is a hot topic. It's a hot topic anyway, let alone what's happening in the current political environment. So I ask you to be as cooperative as possible, and basically it's no fighting is what I'm saying. I'm looking at my notes, I'll just say it bluntly. So yeah, everyone express their views. It's an exchange, the whole idea of MFU is an exchange of ideas, it's learning, it's knowing about what's happening, and we all learn from each other. So I think that's kind of the spirit that we'd like to hold these seminars in. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers for today, which we're really excited. We've got Brian Stoddart, who's a former Vice-Chancellor and Emeritus Professor at La Trobe and Higher Education Advisor on World Bank, Asian Development Bank and EU development projects in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And we've got Firas Massouh, Arabic translator and writer, who's currently finishing his master's dissertation on Syrian political dissident Yassin al-Hajj Saleh. So over to you, Miki.
Thanks very much, Saba, and thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate your support, and I hope you enjoy the evening. The first thing we're going to show you is part of the format for the evening is each of the speakers got to choose a mediated item. And we're going to show you Brian's mediated item first of all, which is of course going to throw a big spanner into the works because it might be in some of your eyes. It's going to go up onto the wall here. Some of you might... No, it's pretty good actually. Some of you, if you want to see it, might need to stand up and just come and gaze at it. It's just a slide. You can have a look. And so, Brian, pretty simple then.
Well, that was the reason I chose it. I thought it showed how simple the whole thing really was. And there's not enough people here who'll be old enough to remember the Barry Jones spaghetti meatball thing, and the same with Kim Beazley, where there was a whole series of policy strategy initiatives that were set up in much the same way, and of course the electorate just looked at it and said, that's way too hard. And the reason I chose it, there's actually two. One is, blinding insight in the obvious, in that it is incredibly complex. And one of the things that's happened really over the last 4 years is that it's become infinitely more complex and more multidimensional and more difficult. And the reason I say that is because I think from the outset, at least in my view, there was a very simple, almost knee-jerk reaction in the West that this was just another domino in the Arab Spring. When I think for most people who had any kind of observation about Syria knew even then that it wasn't going to be just another brick in the wall, as it were. And everything that's happened since then has become infinitely more complicated as a result of that. And some of it, I think, has flowed over into the policy settings, particularly in the West, and I think we're seeing some of the consequences of that, certainly in the last 2 years and most definitely in the last 12 or 15 months. The second reason I chose it, Miki, was really because I think what it does, perhaps indirectly, is show why now we are starting to contemplate some compromises and alignments that even 2, certainly 4 years ago, just would not have been thought about. Now, some of you, I'm sure, saw the Late Line interview with Harlan Ullman a couple of nights ago. He was the guy who dreamed up the shock and awe program in 2003. And at the end of that interview, he was saying quite clearly, well, one of the difficulties for the United States now is that we have to deal with Bashar al-Assad. Now, if someone had said that even 15 months ago, you would have probably said, that is just not going to happen. But what that diagram demonstrates to me is precisely why it is starting to happen, and why that, on the surface, lack of logic actually has a very deep inherent logic to it.
Because actually, as complicated as that looks, that's only a very small part of the picture probably as well. I mean, there's very much more many groups involved in the crisis as well.
Absolutely. And we see now with what's happening, say, along the Syrian border, is the best demonstration of that. And the other one that you see now that perhaps you wouldn't have thought about 2 or 3 years ago is Hezbollah now working in a very particular way in Lebanon across the border into Syria and against IS. Now, those sorts of complexities were just not on the radar probably 2 years ago, and in some cases even more recent than that.
Tell me about your personal connection with the country, because you were there just before the uprising started.
Yeah, I was very fortunate. I was working on a higher education reform program with it was a European Union project, and we were doing two particular things, and one was working with the Ministry of Higher Education in Damascus, really to look at trying to improve the quality of the universities there on the grounds of, a better intellectual output was going to lead to a better societal result. And the universities there, I think people sort of don't understand how big they are. Damascus University then was about 130,000 students. And the second part of what I was doing, I was also working on strategic planning and development with a couple of individual universities. One was Al Bath in Homs, and the other one was Tishreen up in Latakia. So I got to see large areas of the country and actually see inside the universities and get to talk to students and staff and all of those sort of things. And I was there for almost a year, and it was just a terrific experience. It was fantastic.
Yes. Yeah. Did during that time that you were there, was there a sense from people that you were speaking to and that you met that something was going on, something bubbling beneath the surface?
Only right towards the end. And I think there's two functions of that. One is what was actually happening itself, and the second was, people perhaps getting to know me a little better and being able to trust me a little bit more. But certainly the people that I met, I made a conscious decision when I went there, because I wanted to go to Damascus for a very long time. And there were, I think, another 25 international consultants on this project. It was just a nightmare. And every one of them stayed up in Abu Ramana. And I made a decision that I wanted to stay in the old city, so I hired an old Arabic house right in the middle of the old city, about 100 steps from the southern wall of the Great Umayyad Mosque. And because I was living in the city, a lot of people talked to me in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have done before.
Okay.
And towards the end of the time that I was there, certainly a number of the people that I saw every day were saying that the common refrain was that they were looking for a little bit more democracy and a little bit more freedom to make decisions and choose what they wanted to do and those sort of things. There was a fair amount of that amongst university students, obviously, and I got some of that even in Homs and even surprisingly in Latakia at Tishreen, where you might not have expected that would be the case because of the Alawite composition. So there was certainly pressure there, but I'm in the happy position of having been incredibly wrong. But I content myself with that. So was everybody else. I mean, all of the observers that I really respect in this whole thing, like Josh Landis and whatever, none of them ever thought it would get to this stage, and it was simply because there was an untapped sense about what was going on in there. And I think the diagram and the evolution of the diagram on the ground had a great deal to do with that.
I mean, in the West, there's been, I think in some ways, there's been a simplistic sort of tendency to say that Bashar al-Assad, big head of an autocratic regime, dictatorial, automatically see themselves in opposition to that. Is it that simple, though?
Look, I don't think it ever was, and it's one of those sort of dangerous areas for discussion because people have very different views about it. But we were talking just before we started about, in a sense, the imagery that was created around Syria. And the dichotomy for me was, before I did that project, I spent a year in Jordan. And, the typologies that had been set up really since 2000, 2001 was that, yes, Jordan, sort of the moderate state, pro-US, very straightforward. I actually saw more civil tension in Jordan than I actually saw when I went to Damascus. So there was all these sort of odd mixtures of things that were there. I mean, Jordan's got an Islamic constitution. Syria actually has a secular constitution. So those sort of things weren't generally that well broadcast, at least in the West, or at least in the mediated forms that we saw.
Yes.
So seeing some of that made you think very differently about how this actually operated on the ground. Now, I think there's no doubt, you read the literature, read the fictional and the non-fiction literature, and there were clearly major problems inside Assad's Syria. But there were also other things that were happening. Remember, the thing that... And so much has happened in 3 or 4 years that it's easy to forget what was happening back there. I mean, the reason that I was on this project in Syria was because the EU, led by France, was actually trying very hard to get a foothold in the country, sort of recreate the trade links, recreate all those old links and all of those sort of things. That was only 4 years ago. So if they thought Assad was that bad, well, they were interacting with that regime then.
Yes.
And yes, there were problems with it, but it's never been as clear cut as yes, bad, good, whatever. And we know that.
That's right, as that slide very clearly shows. I know you not still keep in contact with a lot of people in Syria, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit what their situation is like, including whether it's different depending on where they're based in Syria.
Yeah, it is. And the first thing to say is that the scale of the displacement is really reflected in what's happened to the people that I've worked with. Particularly over the last 6 months, more of them have left. There's now very, very few actually left in there. I've got a couple in Homs that I still talk to occasionally. I've got a couple in Damascus, but the others are in Beirut, London, Italy, Germany, Turkey, and everywhere else. And that just underlines the scale of what's actually happened to the population as a whole. All the reports that we get, and we're going to talk about social media at some point, but all the reports that we get, life is extremely difficult. It's getting more and more difficult. The support levels are almost non-existent. Localisation has taken over incredibly because a national approach to this is just not possible anymore, as we've known for at least 12 to 15 months. It's a really, it's a tragic situation.
And working in international development, what sort of long-term effects do you think that disappearance of people has for the country? Do you think a lot of them will eventually come back, or that must be a massive brain drain?
And there's been, I think in a sense, there's been that brain drain for a long time. What's actually happened is it's become accelerated. And what we know from elsewhere is that in situations like this, the swing back is never as strong as the swing out. So there is going to be a great loss, and that has a catastrophic set of consequential impacts as well, because what we know is that, say, places like Jordan and some of the other Middle Eastern states, plus some of the Asian states, the swing towards investing in higher education has been about long-term economic growth and long-term lifting of expertise levels. And in the case of Jordan, it was very clear. It was because they knew increasing numbers of their people were going to go out. What their second biggest, well, actually their third biggest budget income at that stage, behind the US money and tourism, was actually remittances from overseas Jordanians. So the whole argument about improving the educational standards was because more and more of those people would go out and send more and more remittances back. And there's that aspect, I think, that's to be looked at in the case of Syria, because it's pretty clear if things keep going the way they are, those remittances will not happen. So that the economic downturn is actually going to get into a real spiral.
So on the social media note, because I know you're interested in this sort of nexus between sort of social media and how that plays out in real life, I guess, if social media, it cannot be called real life. The Syrian civil war has been called the most socially mediated civil conflict in history. What are your thoughts about how things like Twitter have shaped the conflict itself?
Well, I'm in the happy position of Miki actually told me about this question. So just before we started, I flicked up Twitter, And I can tell you from the Damascus Bureau about 5 minutes ago, for those of you who follow it, there's a report on looting spreads in the Damascus suburb of Jaramana, quite detailed accounts about what this has happened. This is what's been going on from the start. And I think one of the most extraordinary things has been the amount of material that's been on Twitter in particular. To me, not so much Facebook, but the Twitter news feeds have been extraordinary because you can. It came home to me one day, fairly early on, when I was sitting at home doing some writing and flicked up Twitter, and I had a report 30 seconds before about shelling in the middle of Damascus, and you know, to get that level of insight, and when you then started patrolling around and seeing what was there, some of which you could filter out, some of which you didn't really want to filter out because you were getting so many different versions of what was happening. It's had an enormous impact on the publicity of all of this stuff, and I think we're seeing that in particular now with IS. And I think a lot of the commentary that's been going on about that is precisely around that point, because the in a sense the social impact has been so much greater. The upside has been that it's been a lot easier to track sort of friends and acquaintances and whatever actually in Syria itself. But I think the impact of the broader messages that have been put out by the constituent parties has caused a lot of confusion, I think, in the West. And I mean, again, you know, everybody's got their own view, but when we've got a situation that the Mass Observatory is still seen as one of the main fallback sources of information for Western media, despite what people like Patrick Coburn and others have written about it and demonstrated about it, then there is a very soft side to all of that as well. But it's been enormous.
I'm sure many of you might have questions about social media when we turn to the question phase, but we're going to move on to Firas and show you his mediated item, which is actually a video. So it goes for about 2 minutes. So if you can't see, you might want to shuffle forward.
Thank you.
Good evening. This is not my house. For the last 20 months, I've been living in Adi. This is a friend's house, not my books and not my desk. Yassin al-Haj Saleh is a great Syrian intellectual. He emerged long before the latest Syrian uprising or Syrian revolution as an important intellectual, a critical voice. I'm writing a column every week in the Hayat newspaper, trying to explain what's happening, where are we now, what are the motivations of what's happening in the country.
One of the most authorized voices in current Syrian politics. Yassin is also a committed intellectual, thus giving context and nuance to his opinions and contextualizing them in a wider field.
Even his journalistic pieces provide great insights into the nature of the state, its policies, the importance of issues democratization, critique of human rights. We want to move out from the serfdom condition, from being treated like slaves to freedom. That's all, nothing more than that. I hope I'm an agent, an active agent in this struggle. And I am honored by doing this. Yeah, that's it.
Firas.
Hello.
Maybe we can start by telling us why you chose that piece.
I chose this piece for a number of reasons. Namely, he's the subject of research that I'm conducting at the moment. But prior to that, I want to talk about the fact that Syria is an understudied area. When it comes to the Middle East, we have much more knowledge about a number of different nation states in the region. Even those that have theocratic or autocratic regimes. I mean, Iran, we have much more material coming from Iran, for example, Lebanon definitely, Jordan as well. Syria has been shrouded in mystery for a long time, and that can be sort of exemplified in the way Hafez al-Assad, the previous president, Bashar's father, was described as the Sphinx of Damascus. There was always a sense of mysteriousness about the politics of the place, as well as the society. There was a particular image portrayed to the West and to the rest of the world, predicated on a number of points. Basically, Syria is a modern nation state, then becomes more cosmopolitan, more palatable for the West under Bashar, but also at the same time preserving some sort of anti-imperialistic credentials. This form of knowledge, this production of knowledge, has been produced on an official level. There was not much room for critique. So, nonetheless, there was a space, and if we look through the history of the recent history of Syria, we find spaces of critical knowledge. Yassin is one such figure who's been a proponent for this kind of knowledge for about 14 years or so at this stage. So he was arrested in 1980 as a young Marxist activist and incarcerated for 16 years, held without trial for 13 of those years. So until 1993, he had no idea how long his sentence was. And then at that stage, he was told he had 2 more years to serve. After those 2 years, he was offered a bargain, as was and is typical under Assad's regime, particularly with political prisoners, and particularly with non-Islamist political prisoners. So the Marxists and the liberals get a bit of a better deal than the Islamists. Yassin was a Marxist, so he was offered this kind of condition of you either cooperate now with the regime or you spend another year in the most notorious prison, which is the famous Tadmur or Palmyra prison, where he spent an extra year. So 16 years, he comes out, he finishes the medical degree he didn't get to finish in his youth, and then starts to write in a journalistic manner. In the 2000s, when Bashar took inherited power, there was a sense in Syrian society, and especially in Damascus and in the urban centers, that there was some sort of political or social opening. Some people took advantage of that. Yassin was one of those who started to write with a bit more courage about the restoration of civil society. From that point on, there was added pressure, of course, on these groups, on these salons, which emerged. And during this period, and up to the period of the revolution, he did live in hiding as well in that period. Of course, when the revolution started, he was very much a person who chronicled its unfolding. But on an emotional level, you can sense he was very much, as you saw in the video, he is very much one of those people asking for dignity, freedom, democratization, and so forth. But he also remained critically distant from the exaggerations of the media, for instance, from basically from the politics of the uprising, and certainly from the machinations of interference from various different powers.
And I believe you've got a personal connection with him, do you?
Since I've started reading his work, I've corresponded with him. I started corresponding with him about 4 years ago, the start of the uprising, and he was still in Syria, as you saw. For the last year almost, he's been living in self-imposed exile in Istanbul. But throughout this period, I've translated a few of his articles, and I've worked with him on a couple of different projects. He is in a precarious position now. We were talking earlier about exile and the idea of going and leaving and abandoning this life behind, and it is in some ways it is an easy way out of the situation to a certain extent. It is very difficult on an emotional level. People are struggling to fathom what has happened. But of course, the idea of going back is not even conceived by some. For Yasin, living in Istanbul is the closest he can be to Syria for a number of reasons. Least of all, for him to go back to the country he loves, but also for the fact that his wife, an avid activist who we saw her photo earlier, was kidnapped in Douma, which surrounds Damascus. She was kidnapped by an Islamist brigade. His brother, Firas, has been kidnapped by ISIS. So there are these two close people to him who he's waiting for. And of course many others, many other activists who are in Assad's prisons as well.
You mentioned, from what you were talking about before, that when Bashar came to power, there was a little bit of a loosening of the tight grip that his father had had over the country for nearly 30 years. That was sort of known as the Damascus Spring, yes. I think, at that time. There was, and you mentioned Marxists and Islamists as being the two main groups of dissidents, or of dissent against the regime. Were there others, or how big was this Salon group that became after this Damascus Spring, or before that?
One of the most important salons at the time, in the year 2000, was started by Riyad Saif. Riyad Saif was a prominent businessman. He wasn't a Marxist nor an Islamist. He was a liberal, entrepreneurial figure who was interested in opening up democratic spaces. But also he had been himself burnt by the regime. On a business level, he describes himself as the victim of the cell phone contracts. The cell phone contracts was when early in the 2000s, the telecommunication part of this opening was basically a kind of a full democratization of information exchange, and part of that was the introduction of mobile phones. Mobile phones were a novel thing in Syria, and gradually, but also seemingly all of a sudden, you have two seemingly competing telecommunications companies owned by the same person, or more or less the same group.
It was the cousin of the president, was it?
The cousin of Bashar, that's right, Rami Makhlouf. And Riyad Saif felt like he and others who wanted to engage in free enterprise at this crucial moment in Syria's history were left out. So in some sense, he had also progressive politics, and in some sense that was his contribution as a form of resistance. He opened up these spaces and invited, namely, other liberals and Marxists, progressives, and so forth. Not so much Islamists at that time. And in Syria, any interaction or sort of correspondence with people from the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, was quite a serious crime, considered a serious crime. So people tried to avoid that.
And you've got an interesting familial history as well, I think, with your parents being involved in a political movement. Not so much, other than that my parents were both communists, members of two communist families. Like many others
in Syria in the 60s and 70s, because the Soviet Union had this particular relationship with third worldism. I mean, there was a sense of, okay, we have certain stations around the world where we can build good relations, and it was Cold War politics. Syria was one of those places. I don't want to delve too much into that, but to cut a long story short, yeah, my parents ended up, I mean, in a kind of a matter of convenience because of their parents. But they represented what becomes an official communist party, or even an offshoot of that, but that was still palatable in Syrian politics. In Syria, there was, under the Ba'ath, there was something called the Syrian Progressive Front, the National Progressive Front, which was an umbrella kind of group, looked like a parliament but wasn't really much of a parliament, that joined together a whole various number of groups or political parties. Some were Nasrite, so some were Arab nationalists, some were socialists, some were seemingly liberal, and there was the Ba'athists as well.
Okay.
Out of that, there were banned groups. There were groups that weren't very palatable. Yassin, for example, belonged to what was perceived to be a radical Marxist group. So, yeah.
And when, I think were you born in the USSR, or?
The former USSR.
Former USSR, yes.
Yes.
And then, what are your memories from when your parents went back to Syria?
Memories, look, I lived in Syria until I was 10, but even since then I maintained a relationship with Syria. I would go back quite frequently and see family and so forth. This is an interesting question because of my background, I come from a Christian family. Because this brings us back to the politics of current impasse. The Christians, since the start of the uprising, were seen on more or less to be on the side of the regime. That's not entirely true, of course, but there was also this kind of fear mongering. I mean, the Assads definitely worked this line very well, that they are the only thing standing between the safety and well-being of minorities and their expulsion, their extermination and so forth by Islamist bogeymen. Today we see ISIS, for example, and we see how ISIS deals with Kurds, Yazidis, Christians. This is all very real. It is all very true. But ISIS in many ways confirms the regime's narrative. And for me, there's the Assad regime benefits greatly from this narrative. And to me, I can't possibly believe that ISIS is as organic as we make it out to be. In other words, I'm not really sure. I can't back this up with evidence necessarily, but the Assad regime is in some way or another behind some of the things that ISIS commits.
I think in Brian's slide I did notice that there was an unconfirmed funding by the al-Assad regime towards ISIS.
I mean, there are some simple examples. Raqqa, which is in northern Syria, which was the first liberated city by non-Islamic or non-Salafist forces. I mean, it was actually liberated by Free Syrian Army with various kind of tendencies, ideological tendencies. Nonetheless, it wasn't liberated or occupied by ISIS straight away. There was a lot of fighting between ISIS and the Free Syrian Army around Raqqa that led eventually to ISIS turning Raqqa into its stronghold. Prior to that, we have seen the Assad regime shelling Raqqa, but not shelling ISIS. ISIS is fighting on the ground, and the Free Syrian Army is getting bombed from the sky. So on that very level, it seems strange that the very enemy that was constructed by Assad, or at least in the narrative of Assad, is not being fought directly by Assad in any way, shape or form.
Well, at the very least, it's a benefit for al-Assad to have them there.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And to not hinder them.
And going back to the question of the left, actually I read today that John Pilger has suggested that the coalition should work with Assad to eliminate ISIS. And this is something I kind of wrote about a while ago, this sort of the balkanization of the left, not just in Syria, but on an international scale. It seems to me quite odd that a leftist intellectual would now push for a seemingly anti-imperialist regime in the region to work hand in hand with the imperialists.
But in a sense, that's essentially the difficulty we've got now, both at the analytical level and at the policy level, isn't it? Because it's not only that it's fairly clear that Assad's been funding IS in some form, but we know that Turkey's been quite supportive up until relatively recently. We know that they've got access to Qatari funds as well, and this is where the spillover from the domestic sort of resolution of a democratic issue has been spilled out into this almost phantasmagorical sort of international relations nightmare, where the whole depiction of IS has been playing into that, which is why we do now end up with senior policy advisors in the States, like Ullman, saying we will have to work with Assad. And that's really the irony, and it's also the difficulty, I think, for a lot of people trying to make a decision about where best they're going to go. And it's kicking back into Syria as well, because as you were saying before for us, in your family there's some divided views about what should happen and how it was playing out. Certainly one of the main families that I've been in touch with, the elder, the parents were extremely liberal. In fact, the father was still a great believer in the Pan-Arab state. But the eldest son is a paid-up member of the Muslim Brotherhood. So you get, and then there's various things through there.
That's right. I mean, we can even tell that the way that manifests is in the Syrian opposition by and large. There have been quite a divide. It was palpable from the very start. And so this is again why I bring this back to Yassin, because he's the sort of person who had warned about the potentiality of this happening long before the revolution started. I mean, this had nothing to do with the politics of the Arab Spring in general. There was always this fear that the situation, the material conditions under which Syrians lived under the Assads for decades has led some to start an insurgency and not really prioritize what might happen next, what an alternative may be. So much so that there were and there are some people simply fighting to oust the regime without providing any kind of political program. This obviously alienated many, both in Syria and outside of it. And today but that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, of course, is the brutality of the Assad regime against a population. I mean, on a grassroots level also, we can't dismiss the fact that many hundreds of thousands, sometimes, I mean, on one occasion in Hama there was 1 million people in the streets asking for reforms.
And I know you've still got family and friends in Syria. What's their situation like, and does that depend on where they're located as well?
Yes, yeah. Some live in regime-controlled areas, and they have been safe so far. Others have had to move elsewhere. That's on a personal note, but of course this has happened across the nation. People have lost their homes, their businesses, but also their loved ones, most importantly, and also the kind of a collective will to remain, to stay in the country, which is the most detrimental thing.
I'm going to ask you both to respond to a couple of questions, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So the first one is, what does Syria mean to you? Because you've obviously both got very different experiences of the country. So I'm going to, maybe you can start, Brian.
Two things, I think. One is, it was one of the great human experiences I've ever had, and I've been lucky enough to live and work in a lot of very different places. And Syria was just the most extraordinary educational experience and a living experience as well, through the warmth of the people and the people I met. And that's in a sense been one of the difficult things for us, is saying about some areas are safe, some are not. I remember being on the phone to one of my people in Damascus, and I could hear this noise going on, and I said, "What's that?" And she said, "Well, it's the helicopter gunship over the apartment block." And it gives you a very different view of the world. I spent a lot of time up in Yarbrough, which was just the most delightful place, and it's now been almost shelled out of existence. So coming to terms with that's actually been very difficult, and it brings it into a point where you really do understand the real impact of some of these things. So the human experience has just been extraordinary. The second meaning for me is at a much more sort of political and international relations level. This is a really frightening regional experience right now. In two short aspects for me. One is the extreme difficulty, almost impossibility, of policy making that seems to have any kind of shred of credibility or the chance of success. And you can look at that and think this really is one of the great regional crises that we've had for a very, very long time. And the worrying thing is, at the moment, the policy settings don't seem able to cope with that. And I think that's been demonstrated partly in the response to the apparent rapid rise of IS, and the way in which the reactions to that have been framed, which have blown a lot of other policy settings effectively out the window. So in that sense, I think that what Syria means to me at the moment at a geopolitical level is a really serious prospect of very serious destabilisation.
Firas?
What Syria means to me? Well, obviously family and friends and so forth, but this is actually more of a difficult question than it might seem, because it's not just about a personal connection. That's obviously a part of it. One of it is the kind of geopolitical articulations of the current crisis, and that has to do with what Syria is on an official level, in terms of borders, in terms of what it looks like geographically. And what Syria is, in that sense, is a modern construct. I mean, it's a colonial modern construct. So I can't, on the most sort of elementary level, don't have any nostalgia for that. On another level, historically, Syria is very important. Historically, I mean, we have Damascus being the longest inhabited capital in the world. So much history, so much cultivation of human effort and intellectual rigor, as well as, building of societies. So that's sort of in an abstract sense what Syria is for me. But on another level, again, Syria is the Syria of the last 4 years to me. It is that event, no matter how destructive it may be, it's also something that has brought new life into me. And it's something that keeps me going in some ways. Despite the depression and the fact that often you wake up and you feel that there's no end in sight, and of course we do see the reality of the situation. It is very destabilizing across the board, regionally. It has become the sort of theatre for madness. But in many ways, revolutions are about chaos. They're messy affairs. They're not neatly sort of written. We might have to expect that.
Well, it leads very well on to my final question for you both, and maybe Firas, you can start. I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball and tell me what you think Syria is going to look like in 5 years' time.
I'd rather not necessarily look into the crystal ball. It's more about my hopes rather than what I envisage to see, you know. And the hope is for a restoration of commonality among Syrians. Kind of, you know, after this amount of duress, for a population to be able to get back together and find some semblance of unity. That would be my hope over the next few years. And that's the only way we can actually proceed. Yeah.
Oh, that leaves me to be the cynic. And unfortunately, as an analyst, that is what I have to be. 5 years' time, the only caveat I'd make, Miki, is that if we can cast our minds back to 4 years ago and think if we'd imagined that we would be here now, the shift has been extraordinarily huge, which suggests that the shift over the next 5 could be as extraordinarily huge, but in any sort of direction. If, you know, I've thought about this a bit, and it's an impossible question to ask, but 5 years from now, it seems to me that we will have a confirmation of a Balkanised Syria as we knew it 4 or 5 years ago. And that's only because there's 2 markers that you can look at. One is, look at what the situation in Iraq now is. And again, Ullman was on the other night saying it was all Nuri al-Maliki's fault. Because there'd been a terrific situation reached in 2003 and Maliki made a mess of it. Well, that to me is just the most simplistic analysis of all time, which is not helpful because it means that it doesn't actually give you a great insight into what might actually happen in Syria. But when we look at the pressures, say, from Turkey, we know there's going to be a Kurdish state up in that northern sector. We know that the Saudis are going to push hard from the south. We know that the boundaries between the post-1916 boundaries between Iraq and Syria are going to become almost non-existent, porous at best. So there's going to be a complete transfer across there. We know that there's massive shifts going on in Lebanon, so there's going to be pressure from in there as well. Apart from that, everything's fairly predictable. And the only possible result out of that seems to me to be 4 or 5 totally controlled regions under very different regimes in different parts of the state. And in effect, we've seen that in the last few years, because if someone had said to me 3 years ago that there would be something like 20 checkpoints controlled by 6 or 7 different outfits between the airport in Damascus and the city, which is about 30 kilometres, I would not have believed it. But yet that's been, in a sense, that whole fragmentation of the resistance. 4 years ago it was the FSA versus the regime. And then suddenly, in a couple of years, we find it's the FSA versus al-Nusra, and then suddenly they're gone and it's IS, but the border struggles are actually not against the regime, they're against these other competing forces. Now, on that basis, and looking at what's happening in Iraq, and looking at the form of intervention that we're now getting in Syria, it seems to me that 5 years from now there's going to be at least 5 possibly more, separate entities in what we knew only 4 years ago as the Syrian state. And they will all be of very different ideological and practical structures.
Yeah, that is the cynical answer which I wanted to avoid.
Which probably brings us right back to the slide that we started with. So on that note, I'll hand over to Saba and to you guys.
Okay, I won't try to summarise any of that because there were many points that were said. And obviously Brian and Firas brought it in from different perspectives and different associations with Syria. I'll just let the shuffle settle down a bit, but we basically got half an hour for questions and interaction. So yes, I'll open the floor to any questions.
Just in comment to the last part you talked about the balkanisation, that's been the US plan for quite many years before this. Sorry? The balkanisation of Syria has been a plan on the agenda long before any of this happened, and the US agenda was also to take out Assad. I think these are important factors that weren't raised. I have a few questions. First of all, what was Syria like prior to the uprising in terms of education, health, and religious and political freedom? Second question is, what percentage of the uprising over the years was the FSA, and what percentage were these other groups? And in connection with that question, how much of these groups, particularly Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra, how influenced were they from the US in terms of weapons, training, and funding? Yeah, I don't know. The way I observe this conflict is very much through the influence of US, which is never reported. It's always kept under that. They have a clear agenda and they are pulling strings.
Can I put a variation on that?
You could.
In a modest way. There is no doubt that the key policy objective was the removal of Bashar al-Assad. There's no question that was very clearly stated by the US. I'm not entirely convinced myself that they had as much of a game plan that said they were going to balkanise the place, because there's actually that is a major block on some of their regional strategies. For example, very quick example would be if they had that on the border with Jordan, that spells serious trouble for Jordan, and the US definitely doesn't want that. And one of their major policy imperatives has been to protect the Jordan regime. And if they had a completely destabilised Syria, or a whole Syria's constituent parts that were once Syria, that is much too an unstable environment for that. So I'm fairly seriously sceptical about that being part of the game plan.
Washington papers where they talk about it.
Look, there's a number of analysts who will talk about it, but I do not believe that it's actually been US official policy, simply because I think the consequences of that are far too serious. Even allowing for, I think there's a popular view that whatever the game plan it was in Iraq, it didn't work particularly well, so I grant that. But I just don't see that setting out to totally destabilise Syria when you've got Israel very close and you've got Lebanon extremely close and you've got Jordan sitting there on those boundaries. A totally destabilised Syria would not be in anybody's best interest, including the US. I don't know what you think.
Look, I'm not a defender of US foreign policy, but I don't think there's some sort of grand conspiracy theory. There are always conspirators, but that doesn't mean there's a conspiracy theory. And the way things turned out could have gone, could have been anybody's guess. The way the situation we have today And the way it's unfolded for 4 years has been a new reality every single day of the way for every single party involved in this, the US or otherwise. I don't think there was any kind of predetermined game plan necessarily. And I do agree that the splitting up, this sort of fragmenting of the Syrian nation state would be quite detrimental to the area at large.
On the other two things quickly, and this would only be from my view, and you'll have a very different one probably, but on general conditions, one of the great surprises for me was that having spent about the same amount of time, almost a year in both Jordan and Syria, my expectation was of Jordan as a fairly modernised state. I actually found Syria to be more modernised, at least in a superficial way. It was much more modern oriented. The IT revolution was huge, and that led to all sorts of complications.
Bashar was a self-proclaimed IT geek,
president of the Syrian ICT Association.
That's exactly right. But actually, to answer your other question about political and religious freedoms, close to zero, I would say. I mean, the total political poverty in Syria.
Is there harmony amongst the religions? That's my understanding.
Harmony is a very dangerous word here because it's because we have to talk about the history of sectarianism in Syria and the history of the rise of Alawite officers to political ranks in Syria, which starts around the early 60s, 1963, and then 1970 when Hafiz al-Assad comes to power. And power is distributed on a familial kind of clan basis. At the same time, you bring few people from minorities, and as well as from the Sunni majority. I mean, Tlass, for example, Mustafa Tlass, the defense minister, long-time friend of Hafiz al-Assad, was a prominent Sunni figure. There are ways to appease the majority. There are ways to appease the minorities. There's a cosmetic kind of social harmony, but underneath all of that, anything can blow up any second. And the regime knows how to control that through draconian policies and authoritarian rules.
Yeah. And that was reflected to me in some of the structures inside the universities. So, for example, student organisations were almost non-existent. The curriculum was very structured. Not a lot of sort of independent learning, if I put it that way. A lot of knowledge, but not a lot of flexibility to find new ways of thinking or actually pronounce those ways of thinking. Relatively, even allowing for students everywhere being sort of progressive, not quite as progressive as you would have imagined. There was some there, but not as much as you would think, particularly because they were huge organised places.
It's okay. I could
You can
I could
squeeze
go
it in
on. I
another
could squeeze in,
answer.
but you can go on if you like.
Yes. We might just give the microphones out so that everyone can hear.
I'd be very interested to hear your views on an incident that occurred, which you no doubt know about, in Hama, which I believe some people say was the start of the revolution. In 1982, when Hafiz al-Assad was in power, it's puzzled me for several reasons. I happened to be driving through Hama on the day of the evening it occurred. I went to Aleppo. I came back the next day, and there was a child on the road saying, I didn't really understand the transaction, it was with the driver. We went all the way round, maybe 30 kilometres, right in a semicircle round Hama. When I got to Damascus, I tried to find out what happened, and no one seemed to know anything, which I think, had there been Twitter in those days, it would have been a different story. Subsequently, I found out from the British press that, in fact, what had happened was that there was an uprising by the Muslim Brotherhood. Hafiz al-Assad had surrounded the town and shelled it and killed 20,000 people, which I thought was a very serious incident. But on my subsequent return to Damascus, no one seemed to be very aware of it. But so, is it really true that it actually was of that scale? And was that actually
some estimates? I mean, estimates range between 10 and 30 or 40,000 deaths. This was a 3-week campaign on the part of the regime in February 1982, when actually Hafez al-Assad was at the time in hospital. He was diagnosed with leukemia. It was his younger brother who led tanks into the city, basically razed the city to the ground and killed this many people. And this was the pinnacle of a 3-year confrontation between the Muslim Brotherhood and the regime. Now, in Syrian collective memory, this is non-existent. I mean, until this recent uprising started, and that compelled people to sort of revisit and reread history. The majority of Syrians had no idea about this, or could not comment on it. Had some sort of view on it, but would never. You can't go to a dinner party and talk about the Hama massacre of 1982 in Syria. Not that you would at a dinner party. But that's
But was it true that the story I got was that what actually happened was the Muslim Brotherhood in the night massacred lots of Alawite officials?
There were incidents, yes. The Muslim Brotherhood from 1979 had carried out, I'm not sure how many of these assassination attempts or assassination operations, when they did target Alawite officers. That is confirmed. And the regime retaliated the way I described. But again, I mean, to say also that today's situation is only because of that episode is not entirely accurate.
No, I realise that. But what happened between 82 and 4 years ago was what happened to the opposition. If there was a viewpoint, that was the beginning. What actually happened?
Well, one of the consequences was a spillover, because it affected not only the Muslim Brotherhood. The regime reacted so extremely to that episode that had there been any kind of form of sort of political alternative at that point, most of them left. And it was at that stage you start to see a lot of exile groups operating in the UK and Europe.
Yeah, that's right.
And that carried on right up until 2010, 2011.
Because also a new law was introduced into the constitution, which where being a member or being associated with the Muslim Brotherhood was a capital crime.
Yeah.
And any association was basically a dangerous action on any member's part.
And including politically liberal groups, even vaguely liberal. The consequence was that there wasn't a lot of encouragement to do that because the results could be fairly severe.
So during that time, there's a famous Syrian Marxist, Riyad Aturk, whose group was this, one of the radical Marxist groups at the time, and there were two things that they were vocal about. Prior to that, there was the Syrian intervention in Lebanon, which many Marxists opposed, and then with the Hama incident with the Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, these Marxists weren't on the side of the Islamists, but they maintained that the reaction was too severe. It was overkill to go in, and of course there was no transparency whatsoever. There was no accountability or anything like that. So that's again another group that was more so sort of ostracized at that period, during that period. Yeah.
Great. 1, 2, 3, 4, and can we have it one question, please?
Thank you. You've given us a glimpse tonight of a very complex and nuanced situation. I just wonder whether that advice it must be available to our government, but the response doesn't seem that way. I wondered if you could both comment on our response
it's a really good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer. Because I have the same reaction, particularly with the US. When I hear senior policy advisors sort of in public sort of saying some of the things that they do and some of the discussion they have about Syria in particular, it really does become worrying, particularly in the United States, where you've got people like Josh Landis, who runs the Syria Comment website, which is, you know, if you wanted to follow anything, that's the one that's worth following. Josh has some discussions with the State Department and with Defence. I know they talk occasionally, but not on a regular way. And there's so much of the in-house analysis that goes on through a lot of the agencies in particular. And I thought about it, I think yesterday or the day before, there was a lovely piece came out on Twitter somewhere that said with something like 27 major intelligence organisations and a $43 billion budget for them, we don't seem to know very much. And that's, you know, it is a legitimate question, because what we see is, in our case, you know, a lot of our policy settings are going to be based around that kind of analysis, and we're into that. And, you know, the potential developments in Syria as a result of that just seem to be so obvious. You wonder either is that they are being predicted and built into budgetary estimates and troop requirements and all the rest of it, or we genuinely don't know.
Well, it does seem like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Are there policy responses possible, constructive?
Well, I got two answers to that. One is what might have happened 4 years ago, and one is what could happen now. And of course, the two things are totally different. Now, I was never a great advocate for intervention. And a number of analysts shifted position and thought, on balance, the way in which it was going, if Assad was to be got rid of, then there had to be intervention. Just on my brief exposure to Syria and my general sort of political view anyway, making decisions for other people has not usually worked out terribly well in a lot of contexts. And particularly one where you've got a diagram like that, and we're going to get involved in that, and the Americans are getting involved in that, that's a bit of a worry.
That's absolutely true. However, I mean, on the question of intervention, and this relates to policy, you'd find that most Syrians, anti-Assad Syrians, and today anti-ISIS Syrians, have been consistently anti-intervention, even if some were calling for some form of intervention. Now, what form of intervention that was, in terms of what was dreamed of at some stage, was a no-fly zone, something of that nature, rather than actual bombardment from the air. Instead, what we have today is actual intervention, real and violent, and detrimental to the revolutionary potential, or whatever is left of the revolutionary potential, targeting the wrong people as well in some sense, targeting ISIS, not Assad. We need to target both. That's as clear as day for many Syrians. I'm not asking for that, because we knew right from the start that there was no appetite for that kind of intervention on the part of the West. Now, this is not to say, again, to go back, that there was some sort of grand plan drawn up, but it became evident very quickly that that was not on the cards.
One of the knock-on effects of that is your terrific earlier point about the precise nature of IS, and just how really organic it is, because what we've got at the moment is this perception about it sort of rolling out across Iraq, rolling across Syria, and it's certainly been strategically very clever. But just how much momentum is that? You know, the publicity about their community building, their community governance. You know, we mightn't like the shape of that governance, but the whole notion that they can actually provide governance. How substantial really is that? because that perception is what's generated the whole international response, which, I mean, and if you were going to go to the TAB and sort of take a look at it, you'd be putting $100 on boots on the ground inside 6 months. And it's largely because of that perception about what it is that we're dealing with, which is, and I think that's a really serious question.
Okay, the next question. Yes.
Thank you both. You showed the interconnectedness, the complex connections between the different, parts and players in the Middle East. I was wondering what you thought about the effects of the Syrian revolution in terms of, on Lebanon, and specifically on Hezbollah's legitimacy.
It's quite a very, very good question. Very difficult to answer. It seemed clear that if you've been to Syria, and if you know Syrians, you know that even before 2006, the notion of Hezbollah as the sort of vanguard of resistance was very much a value that was upheld by the majority. Even at that time, there was this sort of sectarian discourse of Shia Sunni was not really at the fore. I mean, it wasn't that strong, and so as a result, Hezbollah had a particular place in the broad Arab imaginary. In 2006, of course, many people from South Lebanon fled into Syria and were treated as family by many households. It's amazing how that sort of changed. I mean, that changed in 2011 almost abruptly, because of the position that Hezbollah took. The position was political at the start, and then that gradually became a more real political, physical. Hezbollah is actually present in Syria, and the strange thing is, I mean, I spoke to so many Hezbollah supporters over the last few years, and there was a staunch sort of denial about Hezbollah's actual presence in Syria, and then it was about a year ago that it became a reality. Yeah, Hezbollah is actually in there. It is fighting battles like in Qusayr and elsewhere. In terms of Lebanon, and Lebanon is volatile enough as it is. The problem with Syria is also not so much with Hezbollah as much as what happened in terms of the north and the kind of the rise of Salafist rhetoric and sentiments in the north, and that was a big scare. This kind of division in Lebanon once again because of what was happening in Syria.
Yeah. And the presence was a really interesting question because the Hezbollah office wasn't actually all that far from my house. You could find it and you knew it. I'd shift that slightly because I think what your question does is spotlight something else that's starting to happen around the broad-scale analysis, because there are now a number of analysts taking the view that what's happening with the exile of largely Sunni Muslims from Syria into Lebanon, it's changing the whole dimension, so that Hezbollah now is actually fighting to maintain its primacy in Lebanon, which is why they're actually pushing back over the border to fight with Assad. And of course that then springs out into the whole Iran question, which we haven't actually talked about, because why do we do that? Because we know that the Saudis are not happy about the Iran connection and the alleged Shia connection there, and so on and so on and so on it goes. So that Hezbollah connection is actually really significant. And it has been for some time in Syria. You could go into restaurants and suddenly all the televisions will be on for it'd be a 3-hour lecture by Hassan Nasrallah,
yes, that's right.
which was terrific. And the attention being paid to it was generally fairly significant. So that's there, and I think the whole point about that border stability or not stability of Lebanon is a really key part in what happens over the next 12 to 24 months, in my view.
Next question. Yes. Okay. Yes.
It's me.
It was actually the.
I was just interested in a historical perspective because Syria was for many years, in ancient history, part of the Roman Empire, then part of the Ottoman Empire. Where did this modern nation state come from? And that formation, what those ideals back then, where are they now? What's been this perspective over the last 70, 80 years? Just to fill in a few gaps.
Okay, my quick take on this, and you can give the expert version. My quick take on it is, with Syria, as with almost every other state that we're dealing with, Sykes-Picot 1916, draw some lines on a map, and there suddenly you've got new states. And what effectively happened was that there were a whole series of vacuums, and we know what happens in those situations where power will flow into a vacuum. So that's what happened in Jordan, it's what happened in Syria, and it's what happened all the way through, with the added dimension in Syria of the post-Ottoman, but also the French Mandate. So that you then had the complexities of the post-Ottoman regime with the French Mandate taking over at the end of the Second War as a result of Versailles, and then you got that layer over the top of it, which led to a whole series of political reactions and political formations through the 30s and the 40s. That built back into the power boss groups in Damascus and elsewhere. So in a sense, I'm not, and you will know better than me, but I'm not sure that over that period from 1918, 1919 up until 2010, 2011, there were actually any major new nation state sentiments of a coherent governmental kind actually formed at any point, because what you had was a series of power shifts between 3 or 4 major groups, which effectively led to the Ba'ath Party. So,
yeah, if we look not 80 years ago, we go back to post-French mandate, so independence in the late 40s, and then up to 1963, we have about 15 coups d'etats in Syria. Military regimes, as well as Democrats, as well as liberals, and so forth. A lot of tumult on the political level in Syria at that time. In a sense, the Ba'ath comes and it actually does provide that kind of political stability, that sort of benchmark for what politics is. What politics is in that sense is one political party that rules over state and society. And that has become the Syria that we all are familiar with. But if we sort of bring that back on a philosophical level to the revolution, to the Arab Spring in some ways, what Syria is and what the region is in many respects is still a region plagued by the post-colonial condition. Yeah. Some people at the outset of the Arab Spring, as a great American-Iranian scholar, Hamid Dabashi, who basically thought or imagined the Arab Spring as the end of post-coloniality. Now we know that that's not quite true. It seems evident that the post-colonial is still very much alive and well in many respects.
Yeah.
And just like we talk about revolutions, for Hegel we have Reformation, Enlightenment, then Revolution. It's not quite the same for our region.
It's not how the Arabs do it. We had one fourth question.
Thanks everyone for presentation and fucking informative whatever. You mentioned your thoughts on your prediction on a fairly certain establishment of a Kurdistan or a Syrian Kurdistan. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, understanding that it's my certainty, not anybody else's, because I think everybody's got a different set of certainties about this whole thing. The only reason I could see a fully fledged Kurdistan not emerging is if the Turks start taking a very different stance to the one they've got at the moment. And Turkey, I think, is now in a really awkward position because they haven't moved at all, and it's probably now too late. So they watched all of that actually going on over from 2011 through to last year, where that section of Syria was effectively given away by Assad, recognising that in a sense it was a buffer zone. Now, I don't want to accord too much sort of strategic nous into all of that, but it just seemed to me to be a practical political consequence which is going to last on. Now, what we do know is that Iraq is not particularly happy about that, and Turkey is most definitely not happy about that. But given the level of the international play now, it seems to me unlikely that Turkey would be supported in trying to eliminate that. And I think it's in the interest of most players now to see that happen. And I think in some respects, it's kind of interesting, really, when you think about it in a linear sense and also in a geographical one. We had a massive and fairly immediate international response to the Yazidi problem. Yet in Syria, for the last 4 years, well over 100,000 deaths, half of the population displaced, something like a third of the population actually now in refugee camps outside the borders. Yet the response to that was not nearly as immediate or significant or as direct and interventionist as to relieve the Yazidis. Now, that was it was a good thing to do, but I think there's actually some strategic imperatives that sat behind that, and I'm pretty sure it's got to do with the Kurdistan question.
We're going slightly over time, but we've got one last question there.
It's not really a number question, but how far are we from the original uprising? Like the original uprising that happened in the Arab world and Syria, that was about dignity, freedom, democracy. We've seen it sweep through North Africa, and now Egypt's gone the opposite direction. We're going back to a dictatorship in that sense, or a military dictatorship. We see Syria going into total chaos and probably, be fighting an Islamic State for the next 5 years. With how would Yassin answer this in that sense? Basically, I'm asking you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I told Brian earlier that for Yassin, we're currently fighting three monsters. We can either think of it as three monsters or one monster with three heads. In Syria, on a Syrian level, at the very least, we have the authoritarian head, the Islamist head, the theocratic head, that is, and the head of Western intervention. That's how he would answer this. We are very far away from the ideas of March 2011 in Syria, and that's because that's because the actual everyone's fine, yeah. No one's harmed. That's because of all the reasons we talked about. The demographic is not quite the same anymore. The very people who led the charge, so to speak, in Syria at that early stage. Many have been assassinated. many have been detained, and we don't really know where they are. I mean, personally, I know people who have just been disappeared. We don't know where they are. It's as simple as that. Actually, about 2 nights ago was the death anniversary of Mash'al Temmo, who was assassinated in 2011 around this time. So still very early on. Mash'al Temmo was one of the most courageous Kurdish Syrian activists, not really calling for a Kurdish nation state, very much part of the national emancipatory movement at the time, very influential. These influential people, I mean, there was a manhunt on the part of the regime at the start. When we have the kind of the charisma of the movement being stripped away, there's not much left to work with, and unfortunately, that's what we're left with. Yeah.
And one of the great ironies, I think, and it will probably come out over the next couple of years when we look back in a slightly more reflective way. It seems to me almost the only group that is following exactly the same policy that it was 4 years ago in all of this now is Bashar al-Assad. I mean, the regime is the only one that's had a consistent focus because it hasn't had to react in the same way to most of the other players. And that's one of the reasons, it seems to me, why the regime has been able to survive as long as it has. And remember, in the early stages, there was, the early thought was that the regime would put down the uprising very, very quickly. That proved not to be the case. And then the popular view was Bashar al-Assad would fall very quickly, and guess what happened? The regime started to pick up again. One of the key reasons for that, I think, is simply because most of the other players, the FSA and everybody else, has had to modify their approach to what's been going on because of the change in circumstances occurred almost on a weekly and monthly basis. When you think back, 2 years ago, and Aleppo effectively fell. The largest city in the country, one of the strongest business heartlands, all the rest of it, yet Bashar al-Assad is still there. And it's because of the changing circumstance around them.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry to keep you. Just want to thank our speakers, Brian and Firas. They've got some yummy Arabic sweets there. And hope you can join us next week, same time, same place. We'll be talking about Lebanon, so maybe kind of extending on today's discussion. And please hang around. If you've got any further questions, you can ask our speakers. Thank you.